In order to trace the spread of book production in the early Middle Ages, we must trace the spread of monasticism. By the 9th century, the monasteries were firmly established as centers of power. Each had scriptoriums where the books were copied and bound. They were often copying the Bible, but also books of Psalms commissioned by the upper classes, as well as classical texts of Homer and Virgil. The technical process to producing medieval books is generally the same. First, a quire, or called a signature in printed books, 4 pages folded together. Puncturing the quire in standard intervals is required for sewing, ruling or making lines by a stylus, lead plummet, or ink. If parchment was being used as the writing surface, it required further preparation, such as pumice for smoothing, chalk for whitening, or starch grain to prevent the ink from bleeding. Rubrication is the application of headings, which involve decorating, painting, and illumination, the fine art of applying gold leaf to letters and images. The final stage in book production is binding. Manuscripts were sold unbound, so binding took place after the manuscript was purchased. It was initiated by the owner of the book, often far from where it was originally copied or printed. In many instances, especially with printed books, even the rubrication, decoration, and illumination were likewise initiated after the book was bound. Sewing frames held leather thongs in place. The signatures were positioned with the fold against the thongs in the frame. The thread, which was often made of linen, fastened the signatures to the thongs, produced the ribbing that we see on the spine. This one is called a Coptic binding, not bound in leather, and the book stays flat when it's opened. Coptic binding existed from the 2nd to the 11th century. Stitching keeps the quires together. A kettle stitch is a stitch that loops the thread back over itself for a more secure bind. Headbands are attached to quires at the top and bottom to fasten them to the covering. A hardbound book, bound in stout boards in the medieval period, was covered in leather. The boards were attached to the text block, that's the sewn quires, by running the bands through small holes bored in the beveled edge of the boards and then fastening them on the inside. Then using what's called a paste down on the inside cover hid the thread attachments. After this, the external decorations or embellishments were applied. In the early days of bookbinding, the nature and elaborateness of a binding was directly related to an owner's willingness to pay for it. And in the medieval scriptura, bound leather manuscripts would have been decorated by using small stamps that were pressed into the leather by means of hand tools. Blind tooling is a dark impression made by pressing dampened leather with a heated brass finishing tool. The earliest examples of leather tooling date back to the 5th century. As the craft progressed, larger decorative stamps called panel stamps were used. Large rectangular bronze plaques, usually cast, had pictures in relief, and they were stamped by a press. Panel stamps became enormously popular in the Netherlands, and the Dutch became known for their elaborately decorative stamps. This example is brown calf leather, blind tooled over wooden boards with 2 gilded silver clasps. Here we can see examples of the 2 types of tooling. One is smaller shapes of diamonds and triangles, and the other is a large panel stamp. It shows 2 columns of animals in winding foliage, which was common at the time. The closure clasps are remarkable because not only do they mimic the pattern in the panel stamp, they are also sawn out bandrols with the date 1497. The clasp has a hinge, which is closed using a little pin that's fastened to the catch by a chain on the other side. The fact that the date appears in both the stamp and the clasps is rare and means that the binding was done for a special occasion. In the Middle Ages, textile was a welcome addition to the materials available to bookbinders. It was especially used for books in royal collections and books for women. This was known as a chemise binding and was often quite refined. The one here covers wooden boards. It's made of velvet on the outside and red silk on the inside, with trimmings in gold thread and a silver fastening, and is likely from Spain in the 15th century. The manuscript itself seen here is a Book of Hours, which will be discussed later. By the 19th century, textile binding had evolved into intricate embroideries of silk embellished with pearls, especially under the influences of Elizabeth I, who was fond of these artistic materials. Treasure bindings are the finest forms of embellishments. They're a luxurious book encrusted with gold, silver, and gemstones such as sapphires, diamonds, emeralds, pearls, and garnets. The books receiving this exclusive treatment were venerated religious texts commissioned by or created in the abbeys, where the monks themselves were often celebrated artists. This is the Lindau Gospels, not from 9th century Germany. Unusually, this artwork was created over several centuries in different regions. The back cover is from the 8th century and was likely made in the region of Salzburg, Austria. The front cover dates to 100 years later. It was likely produced in what is today eastern France. The manuscript itself was written and illuminated in the monastery of St. Gall, Switzerland. At some unknown point in time, precious silks from Byzantium in the Middle East were attached to the inside covers of the manuscript, thus adding another layer of complexity to this fascinating object. This one is the Berthold Sacramentary from Germany in the 13th century. It is named after Berthold, the abbot who commissioned it. This book includes representations of the abbey's patron saints, Martin and Oswald, and the abbot himself. On the images inside, gold leaf is applied mirror-like, and it even has little curtains sewn in over them to protect the gold leaf. Books of Hours. In the Middle Ages, Latin was the only language that had a written form. Ordinary people were not taught Latin, even though it was the language of the Bible. Before Gutenberg's printing press in 1436, every Bible was written by hand, and it was unheard of for anyone besides the Catholic Church to own an actual copy. In the Catholic Mass, the holy words of the divine office were whispered in Latin by priests with their backs turned to the congregation. With access to God so controlled, people longed for something of their own right that would parallel the use and function of those sacred texts and prayers. What was known as the Book of Hours bestowed direct, democratic, and potentially uninterrupted access to God, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. In other words, it promised answers to the great questions of existence. The Book of Hours was a book of prayers to be said at home, marking the hours of the day. The core text comprised the Hours of the Virgin, the doctrine of the time, which gave rise to the cult of the Virgin. The idea was that petitions to Mary were relayed to her son, and what son can deny his mother? Everybody had them, from kings and queens to housewives, merchants, and children. The main prayers are called the Hours of the Virgin, but the book also includes other sections such as Hours of the Cross, Hours of the Holy Spirit, penitential psalms said to resist temptation, and the Office of the Dead for last rites. The content varies enormously because the books were personalized to their owners. Most literate, read upper class, people would have had some working knowledge of Latin, in which the Book of Hours was written until 1400. Its psalms and prayers were repeated and memorized by everyone daily and did not change, so the average literate person would have eventually understood more than we probably think. The significance of the Book of Hours to the populace of the Middle Ages cannot be overstated. The books were commissioned as a way to personalize them. These bound books of hours became sources of pride for families and was often the only art anyone owned. On the pages of the Book of Hours, around the outside of the text, are illustrations known as miniatures, which were beautiful, artful decorations done by the craftsmen of the bindery. Illuminators were the expert craftsmen in the application of gold leaf to letters, words, and pictures, providing a kind of holy highlight. This is where more personalization came in, as although the miniatures often represented what was being discussed in the text, they also included images of the book's owner, or family, or momentous occasions. One notable example contains over 80 self-portrait images of the book's owner, the first selfies. Speaking of which, our modern-day books of hours are cell phones. The Bible, Torah, and Quran can be referenced from them. There are apps that can calculate what times of the day to pray. But moving from religious to secular theme, there are even more similarities. In them, we keep all the things we do with the hours of our days. The miniatures are our photos of momentous and not so momentous events. Illumination becomes highlighted hypertext, and self-portraits are selfies. The binding, or cell phone covers, which serve to protect the contents in design, can be very personalized in plain or priceless ways. Of course, instead of God, what the cell phone connects us to is the great vessel of information, the internet. With this constant connection, there's still that kernel of tantalizing potential for something synergistically greater, and in that space, there just possibly might be the answers we seek.